Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinar on compliance issues. I'm Ann Lavelle, for anybody who doesn't know me. I practiced management side labor and employment law for about a quarter of a century and retired to spend more time with my family. But I always liked the education piece of things, so I enjoy doing this. I'm very casual, so feel free to put questions in the Q&A as we go along. I'll try to answer them as we go along. If we're running close on time, I'll stay as long as anybody can stand me and answer any questions that we may have in the queue. So this webinar is being recorded like all the webinars we do. So if you missed part of it or whatever, you can look it up later. It does take us about 24 hours to get everything on the website and sent out and all that good stuff. And I am not in charge of that because my technical skills are not what you would hope they would be. So with that said, we have scheduled today's webinar on the 18th, which is the third Thursday of the month. If you're just tuning in, normally these are scheduled on the second Thursday of the month, but because that fell on 9/11, we thought out of respect for that, we would postpone the compliance webinar for a week here. So normally, if you want to tune in, it is the second Thursday of every month that we do this, and we're always looking for ideas. So if you have ideas, tell your CTR rep what you want to hear about, and we'd be happy to do that and try to work it in. In fact, today's webinar is the result of multiple requests that we do more on the one big beautiful bill. We as a group have slogged through this, and I truly do believe the term slogged is the correct one, for two previous webinars. And we focused there mainly on those prior webinars on the issues that we thought would impact you all the most in your function as payroll folks. However, we got many requests to talk about some of what I'll call the peripheral items, which will impact you, but not as directly as, say, the tip issue or the overtime issue that we have talked about ad nauseum. So, okay, so somebody actually has asked a question already, and this is actually a little bit off topic, but let me just answer it very quickly. It says, how do we handle union employees that get paid 30 minutes for their lunch, even though they are not working? If they work overtime, do we take off 2.5 hours? Please advise. So it really depends what your collective bargaining agreement says. So normally, there's a couple factors that go into this. Normally, we only count hours actually worked for overtime purposes. So we're going to have to assume that these folks who are getting paid for the 30-minute lunch break are in fact not working. What often happens is somebody says, hey, Joe, can you help us out for a second during the lunch break? And Joe's a good guy, so Joe gets up and helps. So the first question is, do we really have no work going on? The 30-minute paid lunch break may reflect a concept or an idea that they do get disturbed during lunch and they do actually work. But let's say they don't actually perform any work. Okay, somebody's saying they really do not work. So assuming that, the next step is to look at the collective bargaining agreement and see if it's addressed in there. If it's not, then we look at past practice, because that's what the union will do. The union will say, hey, if the past practice has been to include this lunchtime in overtime calculations, then you can't, employer, unilaterally change that. We would have to negotiate about it. Those are sort of the steps. Okay, so they're saying it's not in the CBA. Those are the steps, though. What was the past practice? Did we include it? If we did include it, if historically we have included this as part of the overtime calculation, we're going to have to negotiate. If we haven't, and this is fresh territory, which it doesn't sound like, we might be in a better position to make a unilateral change depending on what the management rights clause says in the CBA. Okay, we've got a little far afield of what we're talking about today, but I hope that's helpful. And anybody else who has unions, we're actually going to talk about a union in a second here with respect to the big, beautiful bill. But that adds a layer of complexity to everything. So in the event, this is what CTR offers. You can look at that. Many of you I see on the client list already, but that's what we offer. Let's talk about student loans first. You may be sitting there saying, I'm in payroll. What do I have to do with this aside from maybe handle the garnishments? I think it's a little bit more complex, and it's something you may want to think about how you want to handle this going forward. So a little bit of background here. The student loan overhaul, and again, anything I say here is not meant to be political to favor one side or the other. I try to stay apolitical in all things and just present information. So the student loan overhaul by Trump is going to affect approximately 43 million people in this country, both current and future borrowers. And those are our future borrowers in the immediate, like next year. Some of the statistics that are out there that are pretty troubling in my view is we've got about 25% of the student loan borrowers who are already in default or very, very, very close to default, meaning they've missed almost 270 days of payments. There's about another 35% that are significantly late on their payments. So we have roughly 60% of the student loan borrowers who are behind in some way, shape, or form, some of them severely. We only have about 40%, and I'm rounding because math is not my strong point, that are actually making timely payments. So back when we had President Biden, he initiated something called the SAVE Plan, and he had lots of concerns about how the student loan system was working and people could avoid paying. There was more forgiveness, lower repayment plans, a variety of repayment plans. But the SAVE program ran into litigation hurdles when a bunch of Republican states sued to stop it. And so it has been bogged down in litigation as it is. However, some of the programs that he initiated in conjunction with that did go forward. And so you've got a bunch of borrowers who under the Biden administration had really low payments, no payments, whatever it might be. And now it's changing for them. What does this have to do with you? Well, you may find some employees very tight. They're already on a shoestring budget. And now we've got this. In addition, the Department of Education, which is overwhelmed with requests from borrowers trying to understand the new system, as well as take advantage, or, and I don't mean that in a negative way, take advantage of some of the programs before they terminate in terms of loan forgiveness and other things. There is such a backlog, it's months. And the Department of Education had half of its staff cut. So we have a backlog, we have employees who are uncertain of what's happening with their student loans, what they can do with them. And in the meantime, a lot of the student loans are moving towards default because the Department of Education is not being responsive because they don't have enough warm bodies to be responsive. And so I promised you we'd talk about a union briefly. The American Federation of Teachers, about a day ago, sued the Department of Education for its handling of its members' student loans. So that's how strongly that union has about 2 million teachers in it. That's how strongly that union felt, because a lot of teachers are eligible for public loan forgiveness if they teach in depressed districts. And essentially, the union accused the Department of Education of intentionally stalling so that these people would default and could not take advantage of the more gracious or more lenient student loan forgiveness programs from the Biden era that are about to expire. So, and I don't want to bog us down in too much student loan, but I do think this is such a critical thing for so many people out there. You're going to get questions. And you need to know what the financial pressures are on your employees and whether you can help them in some ways. And we'll talk about that in a second. So the education department basically said Biden era had too many repayment plans. We've got two now, and that's all we're going to have. And one is the standard plan, which the expectation is most borrowers will be on it. And that is a repayment plan between 10 and 25 years, depending on the amount of the loan. So the smaller the loan, you're going to be required to be in the 10-year plan. If you're up over 100,000, you're going to be in the 25-year plan. And there's like a schedule for everything in between. There's also the repayment assistance plan. So this is meant to help borrowers who are low income. Under the Biden era, there used to be the concept of forbearance and deferment and all sorts of concepts where you could sort of have an income-based repayment plan and, you know, hopefully get your loan either down to almost zero or very little. The repayment assistance plan is meant to replace all of those programs. And at a minimum, everybody will have to pay at least $10 a month, which, you know, isn't that bad. It's meant to keep them in contact with their loan because there's a lot of folks out there who right now under the Biden era plans are paying zero and are detached from their loans. The repayment assistance plan, depending on which side of the aisle material you want to read, will either be the greatest thing that ever happened to us and reduce people's loans even further, or it'll be the worst thing that ever happened to us. So the jury's out a little bit on that as to how that will affect everybody. On top of that, especially for new borrowers, the department's loan simulator, which is meant to help borrowers plan, is down. It's under construction because the meat is not on the bones of these two plans yet. We don't have all the regulations out yet. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out. So the loan simulator, if you have a kid who's about to go off to college, you know, you're looking at that right now and you're saying they're going to go off in the next 12 months, it's down. That's a problem. Okay, so moving on. And again, I promise I will tie this up to some things that impact you all. There's new borrowing limits, not for undergrads, but for graduate students. And you may say, well, I don't really care. I already have my education. I don't care what some 20-year-olds are doing. Maybe they shouldn't get a graduate degree in anthropology. They'll never get a job anyway. So this makes sense. What we need to remember, though, is there's older student population that often go back for their MBAs or whatever it might be. This cap on graduate loans, as well as there's a lifetime limit of all type of loans that we'll get to, makes it really tough for lower and middle income folks to go to what I would call the bigger name, more prestigious schools. Because if you look at like the Ivy League and some of them, they're more expensive than the state schools. Theoretically, if you go to one of those schools, you'll be in demand for a job because of the prestige associated with attending that school. But now we have, because of these caps, a situation where the folks probably can't afford to do that if they're relying solely on student loans. All right, so borrowing is going to be capped at about $20,000 a year. And you're going to have a loan limit of $100,000 per year. That's a drop from $138,000. I'm sorry, a total limit of $100,000 there. If you look at the statistics, depending on the type of school you're going to, that may actually cover it. But we do have to look at the lifetime cap as well, because that includes undergraduate loans. If we look at professional degrees, and this is something I really want to point out, they're capped at about $200,000. But if you look at the cost of medical school, it far exceeds $200,000. That is a concern for low or middle income students who want to go to medical school. So those caps may have impact in certain industries. All right, so there's caps also on the PLUS loans that are for parents. It talks about how much they can borrow, but here's the lifetime limit. Undergrad and graduate loans are capped at a little over $250,000. And probably most people are sitting out there saying, I hope my kid or myself never has $250,000 in loans. But if you're going to a private school for undergrad and then a private school for graduate work, you can rack that debt up pretty easily. I know when I worked for the firm, one of our biggest considerations in recruiting, and this is true for other firms as well, is the concept of this sort of bone-crushing debt that 20-year-olds come out with that might be more than the cost of their house. And so what can we do to help? Is there an opportunity here, particularly if we want to recruit and we have problems recruiting, for us to take advantage of as employers? And the answer is yes, it's always been there, but it's going to be a little bit better now. You can have employer-sponsored education repayment plans that can work for folks currently going to school or who have student loans. The thing you have to remember about that is if you're an ERISA employer, which is almost everybody except government employers and some nonprofits, you have to have a plan document. If you don't have a plan document, you are out of compliance, and that becomes very, very serious. So one person has asked a question, so let me try to get over to the question here, and we'll get back to the repayment in a second. Okay, so that's what I thought. This question is with respect to this as well. The question is, you may be getting to this, but if we provide student loan repayments up to the $5,250 amount per year, that is tax-free. Yeah, it is still tax-free. So it's always been tax-free. It is still tax-free. It's supposed to be indexed to inflation starting after 2025. So theoretically, that amount will climb because it's been the 5,200 roughly for a long time. It has not kept up with inflation, and it certainly hasn't kept up with the cost of college. Even at a public state-run school, you're not going for $5,000 if you're going full-time. So you need to protect yourselves, though, if you're going to offer this, and it can be a great recruiting tool. You need a plan document. That is really important. And we'll talk about plan documents are needed for almost all employer benefits that you have, health, 401ks, anything like that, the FSA, whatever it might be. You need what's called a summary plan description as well as a plan document. And oftentimes what happens is we do what's called a wrap document, W-R-A-P, not rap as in rap music. And the wrap document is one giant SPD, summary plan description, and one giant plan document that includes all our benefits in there in one location. So you need to have a written plan document that you're either standalone or part of your wrap of your overall benefits. Okay, we have another question here. Okay, with needing a plan document for the employer-sponsored education repayment plans, would it be similar to an FSA plan document or a POP document? Yes, it is. So oftentimes you combine these into the wrap. It is the same concept, though, that we have to have a plan document and an SPD. There's different ways of setting it up, but we must have a written document like that because this is an employer-provided benefit. So yes, the person who asked this question is spot on. That's exactly the way you're headed, is a plan. If you have a plan document for your FSA, which you should, this is just similar to it. It's just a different benefit. You may combine them together if you want to have a large wrap document, but you need that. What about 401k loans to pay for college, right? You may get that question as well. So one, you're competing with businesses to recruit that may be offering the employer education repayment plan. Two, you may get questions because people are looking for funds to either fund their own college, or if, like me, they have a 21-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 17-year-old, they may be saying, gosh, where do I get enough money to help my kids with college? So can you use the 401k? Possibly. It's not advised at all because there's significant tax consequences. You could set it up because, again, the 401k needs a plan document and an SPD. Only loans that are permitted under the 401k plan document can be given. So I have seen employers have plan documents that don't permit loans at all, even in hardship situations. It doesn't matter if the employee's house is getting foreclosed on, there's no loan. You can set the parameters of your 401k plan document to reflect whatever priorities you have or whatever protections you might want to put in for employees. So you might say, oh, okay, we'll let them take loans for any purpose that's legal pursuant to the IRS code. And that would include this type of loan. Of course, if they leave without paying it back, that becomes a withdrawal subject to penalties. That can be an issue. So typically it's not advised, but you could set it up that way, assuming you reflect it in your plan documents. And that's just a good reminder in general. Forget about the student loans for a second. Oftentimes people, living paycheck to paycheck and they have some emergency come up or hardship, they want a loan. You need to define what those hardships are and for what, if anything, you'll allow a loan for. And of course, there's caps for loans too. They're basically like $50,000, assuming they have that much in there and want to take that much out. So moving on here, the Secure Act 2.0 provides a match for the 401k up to certain caps, and there's a schedule for that, for student loan repayments. So the idea is if I'm Ann Lavelle and I'm knee-high to a grasshopper, I just graduated from law school and I got, a gazillion dollars in debt and I'm paying $1,000 a month, my employer could say, hey, we're going to match part of that and put it in your 401k, which is a tax favored status, right? And the thought is that we know statistically, people who have student loans don't save as much for retirement as folks who do not have student loans. And so the thought by the government is this kills two birds with one stone. No offense to anybody who's a bird lover. We get to have the student loan repaid, and the employee who normally wouldn't be saving is getting some type of match from the employer for this. Okay. So somebody asked, does CTR offer the service in this plan doc if they use CTR as a payroll provider? Can the employer sponsor education repayment plans be used for parents that are employees that have kids with high student loans? Can we find out more about this feature with CTR? So typically, these plans are typically done by attorneys. So that's really a legal document more than a CTR. There are sort of bare bones templates that you can get from folks, but you got to be careful of how you fill that in. It's just like those bare bone handbooks that I talk about that you open up and it says insert name of employer and the employer has never put their own name in. So CTR can definitely help in some aspects, but the actual plan document becomes more of what I will call a very important legal document that you really should have counsel looking at. One of the reasons I say that is the fines associated. If the Department of Labor, which is the department that's charged with looking for ERISA violations, and not having a document is an ERISA violation, ranges from if, good old Ann Lavelle asks you for the plan document for any benefit that you offer, and I don't get it within about 30 days, the violation is $110 per day, and it's cumulative. There's also penalties that are almost $3,000 per day if the DOL asks for this and you can't produce this. So really important to have these documents, have them done right, because this is telling people, your employees, what you will or won't give them. And that's health benefits, the 401k, the FSA, the education, whatever it is. Very important that you have this. And if you get a template, which they're out there, I've seen lots of insurance brokers hand out templates for like the health plan, SPD, and plan document. If it says something that's contrary to how you operate, your employees have the absolute right to enforce what's in the plan document, even though that's not what you intended. And it may not be what's in your handbook either. The plan document always trumps. And so you've got to be really sensitive to what's in there. Okay. Moving along here. See if there's any other questions. Give me 1 second to get my little cursor back. There we go. Okay, FSAs and DCAPs. Don't you love alphabet soup? If you're in payroll or HR, I think you live alphabet soup. So there's a change coming 1/1/26, and that's essentially a raise to the amount that employees can put in the DCAP. A DCAP is a dependent care account. They are run by definition through a flexible spending account. So when you have a plan document for an FSA and you're running the DCAP through it, which by definition you are, because you're making, the employees are making elections that are sort of set in stone, you must have those documents. So one of the issues you have right now is if you intend to let your employees increase their DCAP contributions for next year, what has to be amended right now? The SPD and the plan document. And if you don't have one, it needs to go in place. So most elections, most plan years for FSA and health benefits run on a calendar year, not everybody, but those elections are going to come up in November or so for what the employee wants to elect. And if your plan documents are not updated to reflect the larger amount that they can opt to put aside, then legally they can't do it. So you really need that document to say, hey, we're going to permit this, we'll run it through the FSA, and your election this fall for next year's plan, assuming that's how you're running a calendar year plan, is now $7,500. Same thing if you have a health, one important thing on the FSA. Let's say you don't have a DCAP, but you have an FSA, a flexible spending account, where people can put aside money to pay for certain health care and they get reimbursed, or maybe you use a credit card, an FSA card that is just meant to work at pharmacies and doctors and stuff like that. An FSA, by definition, even if you're insured for your health plan, an FSA by definition is a self-funded or self-insured plan. So a lot of employers have no idea. And again, this has nothing to do with the big, beautiful bill. This has just always been the way it is, except a lot of employers don't realize this is the situation. The FSA is a self-funded plan, self-insured, because you are responsible for withholding whatever I, Ann Lavelle, have elected to contribute. You're sort of like the trustee of that plan, right? That you're going to give those contributions, and maybe you have a third-party administrator running the claims, but you are involved in the administration to the extent that you're pulling out money, and I'm trusting you to actually deliver it to the TPA. And by the way, there's been employers who haven't done that because they've been strapped for cash. That gets into the criminal realm. You don't want to do that. So what does that mean? Who cares if I have a self-funded FSA plan? There's more ERISA rules for FSAs that are by definition self-funded. So if you have health insurance that's self-funded and an FSA, you may be familiar with all the bells and whistles you have to put into a plan document. But if you have an insured plan for health, which still requires a plan document, an SPD, which is not the same thing as a policy or the little guide that any of the insurers give out, you've got to recognize that you're self-funded for the FSA. And that's important for what we call non-discrimination testing. And we'll get to that in a moment. So health savings accounts, there's now expanded opportunity. So you have an HSA. again, you have to amend your documents to reflect the options that you may want to give to employees. You don't necessarily have to, but you can. And some of the options you can see here that now it includes, we can have an HSA. I will get the acronyms correct here, for the individual market plans that are bronze or catastrophic. So in other words, those are the plans that have the higher deductibles, not as good a coverage, more co-pays, more co-insurance, all that good stuff. And so the government is now saying through the big, beautiful bill, hey, employer, you can help your employees out if they're on one of those plans by allowing them to also invest, set aside money for the HSA. There's also some changes for telemedicine visits, which might be important for all your employees because those can be pre-deductible now. And if you have a high deductible health plan, that could be important. There's also some exceptions for the rare situation that you have a direct primary care arrangement or your employee does. But in order to legally provide these benefits to your employee, you need to amend your plan document to reflect that you will provide these benefits. And employee education is critical here too. How many of your employees really understand the FSA, the DCAP, the HSA? It's like you're talking Greek to them, right? And why they might be good for them or why they might not be good for them. Some education, I think, is warranted here, especially when you do open enrollment, to talk about this is where we're at. We've amended our plan documents. You can now do X, Y, and Z if you want to. And, you know, we're offering these benefits, which again, it's a recruiting thing too, and a retention tool. Because if you're not doing this, if you don't amend your plan documents and you're not allowing some of these benefits, and your competitor down the street is, where am I going to go as an employee? So let's talk a minute about non-discrimination testing. Has nothing to do with the big, beautiful bill. But it's a good reminder at this point because the Trump administration has talked about it. So what in the world is non-discrimination testing? A lot of HR people hear that and they think, oh, no problem. I don't prohibit, minorities from being in my health plan or people who are old or whatever. That has nothing to do with the non-discrimination plan. Of course, you can't prohibit minorities or the old folks who are 40 or older or whatever. But non-discrimination testing with a self-funded plan, whether that's the health insurance plan or the FSA or the DCAP, is supposed to be tested yearly for non-discrimination, meaning it doesn't favor your highly compensated employees. Who's highly compensated? There's different tests for it, but generally we're looking at like the top 10% earners in your company. And you may say, well, I open my plan to everybody. So how would it favor? It's the same benefits for the president of the company as it is for, lowly little Ann Lavelle who's mopping the floors. The problem is lowly little Ann Lavelle doesn't have as much money to put into an FSA. So I might say, hey, I can't afford to lose $50 a month. So I'm not going to use it, or I can't afford to put that much in a DCAP, or I have to have my mom watch my kids, or whatever it is. But the president of the company is saying, or the top 10% of your earners, and again, there's different tests for this, saying, hey, I'm going to take advantage of every single benefit we get. And what you find is there's a disparity that your lower level employees, your lower earners, are not as involved or using your benefits as much as the top earners. That can make you fail the non-discrimination testing. What happens if you fail the non-discrimination testing? Well, hopefully you're doing this before the DOL shows up on your doorstep so that you know if you have a problem with any of your self-funded plans, your health insurance, your FSA, your DCAP, anything like that needs to be tested. So let's say you have a problem and the DOL is on your doorstep and saying, where's the non-discrimination testing? And you don't have it. And now the DOL is insisting that you run it and you find out you have a problem. Let's apply that to the health plan. The president of your organization used his health insurance benefits to have a triple bypass because he had a heart attack. he's got a bill from the hospital that was paid by the insurance, or I'm sorry, it was paid by our self-funded health plan. That's maybe 150,000. If our plan is discriminatory in favor of our highly compensated employees, that benefit becomes taxable to all of the highly compensated employees. Nobody wants to have to tell the president of the company that he now has to pay tax on the 150,000 that his heart surgery cost him. Other plans like the FSA, it may be a lower amount that becomes taxable to the person, but it still results in an unfavorable tax treatment if you fail the non-discrimination testing for anybody who is a highly compensated employee. Okay, it looks like we got some more questions. I'm glad people are hanging in there because this is very dry. Great question by somebody. So somebody said, and I think they're referring to the non-discrimination testing, is this similar to the testing done for 401k plans with Safe Harbor? It is similar. So 401k plans can qualify for different ways to ensure that they're not discriminatory in this fashion. There's safe harbors, there's mass filer sort of exceptions where a company who runs the 401k files for it. I can't think what the word is right at the moment, but essentially mass approval for their 401k plans. This is the same idea, although the tests are run slightly differently. So great question. If you are used to any type of 401k testing, this will either remind you and give you nightmares about it, or if you're happy with your 401k, you may find that you're happy with this too, but you do need to do the testing. A lot of employers don't do it because historically the DOL hasn't been real focused on enforcing ERISA or the non-discrimination testing or anything else. But that has really changed in the last few years because there's such significant penalties. If you're the DOL and you're kind of broke, what are you looking for? Penalties that you can generate revenue with, essentially. And so this has become more and more popular as a DOL investigation. And so it's worth doing, especially if you're a larger company. If you're the mom and pop and real tiny, okay, you got 4 employees, maybe this isn't a big deal. But if you're the 100-person company, which is covered by every single federal labor law out there, then yes, I think you should be testing. And I think, and benefits providers like TPAs can sometimes do this for you. You need to be testing. And if you fail it, you take remedial measures. And there's a whole section in the IRS code about how you can remediate a plan that has failed. All right, so let me see if I can grab one more question here. Okay, so somebody asked, and maybe I just answered this, how do you run non-discrimination testing for the health insurance we offer? If it's insured, you don't run non-discrimination testing. It's only for self-funded plans. By definition, the FSA is self-funded. Who runs this? Oftentimes benefits folks will run this. So there are like TPAs. So usually if you have a self-funded plan, you have a third-party administrator involved, a TPA, who's helping with the claims and everything else. And oftentimes they can do this for you. Attorneys, and what's known as employee benefit attorneys, can do this as well. I will warn you about employee benefit attorneys. They are one of the most expensive attorneys to retain. And you do not want to use some general practitioner for this because the IRS regulations are so detailed. If you're not familiar with this, the attorney will have no idea if they're a general practitioner what's going on. Employee benefit attorneys, you're only going to get them at large firms. They are super expensive, but they can run this. If you are really huge, you might be saying, it might be worth getting counsel involved. If you're smaller, like the 100-person or 50, you might be talking to your TPA to see what they can do for you. Okay, I know we have a lot of questions coming in. Let me keep moving on here and we will get to everything here. So, paid family medical leave. There's some good news, I think, on this. The government doesn't always give you good news, but I think this is good news. So there has been sort of this tax incentive for companies to pay for family medical leave for their employees. And you can see the percentages there of what they can pay, what they can sort of take a tax credit on. But the big beautiful bill expands the credit in a couple of ways. So it used to be you could just take the credit for the wages paid to Ann Lavelle, who just had the baby, or Ann Lavelle, who, has cancer and is off on leave or whatever it is. Now you can also get the credit if you insure for this and pay a portion. It will pay a portion of you're paying a portion of the premiums. You can get the tax credit. It works the same way as the wages. It used to be that if you were in certain states that require paid family medical leave, you could not claim this credit at all. This has sort of been fixed, if I can put it that way, where it says, hey, the big beautiful bill, you can take the credit for any amount that you pay in excess of what the state requires, because oftentimes the state doesn't require that much, or it only requires it for 4 or 6 weeks. And maybe you want to give the benefit to, say, a lady who's had a baby for the full 12 weeks of FMLA, whatever the situation is. You can now take a credit in states where you're required to provide this benefit anyway, if you're providing more than what's required. Guess what you have to have if you do this? A written policy. It doesn't actually have to be necessarily a plan document, but a policy with all of the IRS required bells and whistles. I have, if you type in the instruction form 8994 in the IRS, it pulls up some really helpful information about what you should have in that policy. Okay, the adoption and child care tax relief. So, and I know we've got more questions here too. Let me see what I can drag up here. So the adoption and child care tax relief, the credit is now $2,200 as opposed to $2,000. It phases out for high earners. These thresholds are going to remain in place until 2026, but after that, it's supposed to be adjusted for inflation. So that should help. Consistent with the administration's sort of view on immigration, you do have to have Social Security numbers to take this credit. Okay, somebody has asked a question here about testing for partially self-funded health plans. There probably should be non-discrimination testing for that. I hope you don't mean just like you're paying a little bit of, or you may mean this, that the deductible is like 10,000 or something, and you're doing that. I would still test for that, because again, if I am mopping the floors, I may not go to the doctor very often because I just can't afford the copay. And so we've got the president, and I'm picking on the president of the company, who's taking advantage of this and using all this benefit, and I am not. So if I were going to be on the safe side, I would test that. Somebody else has asked, if you are not an FMLA business, meaning you're under 50 employees, but you have a policy that mirrors the FMLA, which is kind of common actually, can you still use the credit? So this is for, this is for any paid family or medical leave. It doesn't necessarily have to be because you're an FMLA employer. This can be because, hey, I'm located in California and it requires that I pay XYZ, but I'm more generous. So even though I'm under 50 employees and I am in California and I have to pay for 4 weeks or whatever California's law is, I pay for 8 weeks, I'm going to get credit for 4 of those weeks. Or I'm in, I don't know, Michigan, and maybe they don't have a required paid family medical leave, or Pennsylvania, which doesn't really have that either, unless you count the Allegheny County and city of Pittsburgh or city of Philadelphia sort of requirements. And I pay more than is required, but I'm not an FMLA employer. This is not limited to FMLA employers. This is for anybody who is generous enough to want to be giving out some type of paid benefit that meets these parameters. Okay, there's also a credit for essentially any dependent that is out there who's not a child. That's essentially $5,500. It was about to expire. It's not going to expire now, but it's not refundable to your employees. So again, you may only touch on this peripherally, but it's good to know that that's out there in case your employees are talking or asking or whatever it is they may be doing. So adoption and child care tax relief, if we look at the dependent child tax credit. Now, I want to take a second to distinguish that from the DCAP. So the DCAP I set at the beginning of the plan year during the open enrollment or the election period. And I say, hey, I want to put aside the $7,500 because I have maybe a nanny. And that's really expensive. Trust me, a nanny is far more than $7,500 a year. And most daycare is too, especially if you have an infant. And so I take the DCAP pre-tax option, which helps me out. But the dependent child tax credit is also available to me. I just can't double dip. I can't submit the same expenses for the dependent child tax credit that I submitted for the DCAP, which makes sense. The IRS would not want us to double dip. They're not in favor of that, just generally. So I can take this credit, so maybe $7,500 for the DCAP, and then my nanny is maybe $25,000 a year. I can get an additional credit as long as I don't double dip. There are some income thresholds. So there's a phase out essentially. If you earn too much, by the time you're up to the 200,000s, you're phasing this out. But the DCAP, there's really not a threshold to. So that may actually be more beneficial to the higher earners. But if I fall under sort of 200,000, then maybe I can take advantage of both of these. Just a little bit more. So the adoption tax credit is refundable now up to $5,000. Previously, it wasn't. And again, you may never have to deal with this, but it's good to know what else is out there in the one big, beautiful bill. This really benefits folks who adopt from the foster care system, because the foster care system is generally free to adopt from. I have adopted from the foster care system, and they basically, doesn't matter income, they're kind of so desperate to place some of the kids that they pay for all the legal fees for the adoption, which I thought was kind of amusing because I could have done the adoption since I was an attorney, but whatever. And then you can take this credit up to $17,000 and some change. And it used to be, if I adopted from the foster care system, I had little to no expenses. And so I really didn't get any credit for this because it wasn't refundable. And now I do get some portion that's refundable, which will help the folks who are adopting from systems like the foster care system, where there's really not much cost to the adoption. Folks who adopt internationally probably far exceed the 17,000. And so that, of course, they can take the credit for, but there'll still be a portion that isn't covered. Trump accounts. So you may have heard of these. People love them and hate them. And again, I'm not here to debate whether it's the best or worst idea we've ever had, but you can set it up. It's meant to give kids a nest egg, essentially, for when they turn 18. And it's a way for parents to give that nest egg sort of with a tax favored status. It's going to be $5,000 a year. It'll adjust for inflation come 2027. It works very similarly to an IRA. If you like IRAs, you might like this, I don't know. But it's essentially a trust account where the beneficiary is a minor. And for babies, if you're planning on having a little bambino anytime soon, between 2025 and 2028, and you're US citizens, that's critical, and have valid Social Security numbers, the federal government will make a one-time $1,000 contribution. Who turns down money, right? Especially with a newborn. So that is a benefit that's out there if you fall into that category. Okay, we have ended a few minutes ahead of time, which is great. We can go enjoy the beautiful weather. I want to thank everybody for attending. If there's any more questions, feel free to ask. I think at this point we have covered just about everything under the big, beautiful bill. But, you know, come up with other ideas, because this webinar really was generated because so many people asked for these sort of peripheral items on the big, beautiful bill. So if you have other ideas, please let us know. Otherwise, enjoy the sunshine and take care, and I'll see you next month.